When we think of Germans in Venezuelan history, our minds may drift to the Colonia Tovar, a sleepy mountain village where the Black Forest meets the Andes, complete with beer steins, Bavarian rooftops, and bratwurst in the fog. But centuries before that folkloric transplant, there was a stranger, bloodier collision, one where German ambition and Spanish desperation conspired together to stage a colonial nightmare. In 1528, the Spanish crown was broke. Not just broke, but desperate. So desperate they leased a chunk of Venezuela to a German bank like a pawned wedding ring. What followed was one of the most bizarre colonial experiments in history. This is the story of the Welsers of Coro, a strange episode where instead of conquistadores, we had landsknechts in the tropics. Charles V, who at the same time was Carlos I, didn't hand over part of Venezuela to the Welsers because he was feeling generous. He was broke, and not just broke in the way kings sometimes claim to be broke. No, Charles was abysmally indebted. To secure his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, he had bribed half the German nobility, borrowing sums so vast they could only be paid back in promises. The Welsers, bankers from Augsburg, with the instincts of warlords, had financed the whole thing, and in return they wanted more than interest. They wanted leverage, and land, and sovereignty. In other words, a colony. And so, in 1528, the Spanish crown handed over roughly what today is now Falcón, Lara, and Zulia, and parts of Trujillo and Barinas, and Apure as well. Thus began one of the strangest chapters in colonial history, Klein-Venedig, or Little Venice, governed not from Madrid or Sevilla, but from the velvet-draped counting houses of Augsburg. The Welsers were not new to empire, they simply preferred to buy their conquests wholesale. They had bankrolled the wars of Charles V, financed his imperial election with bribes to German princes, and greased the wheels of Rome when the church needed cash. In return, the emperor signed the Capitulación de Madrid, a 1528 charter that gave the Welsers sweeping powers over a territory barely mapped. The right to govern, to tax, to convert, to enslave, and above all, to extract. The Welsers weren't settlers, they were creditors with armor. And what did the Welsers want most? Gold. Always gold. The New World glinted with speculation, and the Welsers, ever the pragmatists, intended to monetize myth. But this was not Cuba or Hispaniola. There were no ports, no plantations, no sugar, just jungle, Thailand, and legend. It would have to be carved open by force, and thus the first expedition was launched. In early 1529, the Welsers sent Ambrosius Ehinger, or Ambrosio Alfinger, to the Spanish tongue, as their first captain and colonial governor of Coro, which had been founded only 2 years prior in a deal between Spanish Juan de Ampilles and Cacique Manaure, leader of the Caquetillo people. When transferred to the Germans, Coro would become Klein-Venedig's capital and the base of all German colonial operations. From Coro, Ambrosius led an expedition inland, seeking wealth, dominion, and a pathway into the imagined kingdoms of the interior. His army was a strange amalgam: Spanish footmen, German landsknechts in their puff sleeves, enslaved Africans, and indigenous porters, some coerced, others conscripted. The force was less a company than a mobile economy of violence. The route westward brought them through the sun-blasted corridors beyond Coro, arid scrublands and shifting sandbanks that marked the edges of the Médanos. Whether they crossed into the dunes or only skirted their perimeter, the effect was the same: wind, thirst, and exhaustion. Armor scorched the skin, horses stumbled, water vanished, the desert punished each misstep with silence. But Alfinger marched on. By mid-1529, he had reached the shores of Lake Maracaibo. There he founded a settlement, New Nuremberg, he called it, in a moment of delirious optimism, a piece of Bavaria in a land that didn't want one. The name didn't stick, and before long it reverted to the one the locals had always used, Maracaibo. As Alfinger pushed south from New Nuremberg, the orders were clear: secure land, extract wealth, and break resistance. But something shifted in the man, or perhaps it was always there. According to accounts from survivors of the expedition, Alfinger became increasingly erratic, his decisions veering between calculated brutality and blind rage. He seemed to have been infected with the same mad bloodthirst conquistadores were known to fall into. Alfinger had no maps, no stable supply lines, only rumors and a royal license to do whatever it took. As they pressed further inland, the expedition began to lose shape. What began as a march started to feel more like a drift, across unfamiliar rivers, over mountains that cracked the sky, into forests too thick for sun. Alfinger's mood darkened with the terrain. He no longer spoke of gold, only of enemies. His punishments grew theatrical. According to one survivor, he ordered a man to be whipped for sneezing during mass. Another claimed he burned a village simply because it refused to kneel. The violence was no longer strategic. It seemed like a byproduct of madness and mood. The Caquetío and Hirajara resisted fiercely. Villages vanished into the forest between Alfinger's men could arrive, but when they didn't, the response was catastrophic. Chiefs were hung from trees, homes were torched, survivors were chained and made to carry what was left of the expedition's ambitions. These were not battles, these were demonstrations. According to José de Oviedo y Baños, Alfinger's own men couldn't endure him. Many soldiers fled back to Coro as fugitives, unable to tolerate the harsh nature of Alfinger, nor the strange manner in which he governed, punishing for the slightest cause with floggings, hangings, and humiliations, carried out by Francisco del Castillo, his field master, a man cruel and wicked of intent. In 1533, near Chinacota, it ended. Alfinger was ambushed in the highlands of Guane, a land he had entered not with flags but with fire. He was struck by an arrow. Some say it was poisoned, perhaps with curare, an alkaloid mixture used by some indigenous groups for hunting. Others say it was the wound itself, festering with infection, that killed him. Oviedo doesn't tell us. What he does say is this: Alfinger bled for 3 days. Fever took him. He died not in glory, but in confusion and retreat. And the land where he fell, a narrow valley in the Andean foothills, still bears his name. The barbarous cruelty of that tyrant still gives its name to the valley where he died, Valle de Miser Ambrosio. The death of Alfinger, however, didn't end the German experiment. It merely exposed its appetite. In 1534, Georg von Speyer was appointed the new governor of the doomed Klein-Venedig. Unlike Alfinger, von Speyer was a legalist, a man of contracts and papers, but still with a conquistador's gleam in his eye. Marching with him was Nicolaus Federmann, sharp of tongue, restless of soul, and one of the few who would leave behind a written record of what these men saw and what they became. Federmann believed that Alfinger had failed not because the land was impenetrable, but because the man was impatient. He saw in Speyer a different kind of ambition, calculated, methodical, and relentless. And yet, even that discipline would unravel before long. In his writings, Federmann described the landscape as a man slipping into another world. The heat was such that many dropped where they stood, foaming at the mouth. Our horses' hooves sank into the earth as if the land itself wished to consume them. The expedition pushed further inland than any before. From Coro they traveled east, then south, through the llanos, across mountain passes, and down into the valleys choked with mist and resistance. Along the way they renamed rivers, claimed hills, buried the dead, and baptized nothing. We slept on stones, woke to arrows, and marched on air, Federmann wrote. We saw men eat the leather from their boots, and others who drank from puddles where animals had died. They crossed territory now part of Barinas, Apure, and into Meta, in present-day Colombia. Federmann believed they were closing in on the fabled El Dorado, an empire of gold, women, and temples beyond the horizon. But what they found instead were resistant villages, empty settlements, and sickness. Still, they kept going. There were times, Federmann confessed, when I thought we were no longer marching across land, but across memory itself, following rumors, chasing shadows. Men began to disappear. Some fled, others died in silence. Supplies vanished. The expedition survived by pillaging indigenous food stores and pressing local people into service as porters. The land yielded no gold, only hunger. In one region, likely along the Guayviare or Vaupés, Federmann claimed his column stumbled upon what he described as human bones stacked like firewood in pots that reeked of flesh. He accused the local people of cannibalism, writing, "They had eaten not only their enemies, but some of her own. Whether this was true, misunderstood, or embellished remains unclear, but it reveals the fear and desperation that had set in. For Federmann, this wasn't just jungle. It was a place where boundaries of civilization were coming undone. Federmann's writing drifts between observation and delusion. He praises von Speyer's endurance, but records the moment their quest turned into a death spiral. We could go no further. We had reached a place where the sun itself seemed to hang lower, like an executioner's hand. The governor wept. By the time they staggered back to Coro, 2 years had passed. Hundreds had died. The colony had gained no territory, no riches, no alliances, only stories of hardship. Still, the Welsers pushed on. There was one more expedition to launch, one more German who believed he could find what others had missed. Philip von Hutten had been there. He had marched with Speyer. He had watched Federmann disappear into the fog. A distant relative of the humanist Ulrich von Hutten, he seemed an unlikely figure to preside over the death of the empire. But when Speyer died in 1940 and the Welser family named him Captain General, he began his mad return into the jungle inferno, a final plunge into a green silence that had already swallowed every promise. He departed Coro on August 1st of 1541, at the head of about 150 men, most of them horsemen, most of them unaware that they were riding into a last chapter of a story already told. He followed the same path Speyer once took, first south, then east, retracing the contours of imperial fantasy as if the jungle had not already made its position clear. Eventually he turned off course, deeper into the Llanos, with only 40 horsemen remaining. There, somewhere in the grasslands, he was badly wounded in a battle with indigenous warriors, identified by some later chroniclers as Omaguas, one of the many people absorbed into the expanding myth of El Dorado. The jungle, as always, did not flinch. From there, the record vanishes. No logbook survives, no lieutenant's diary, only silence, 3 full years of it. The next time his name appeared in any document, it is in reference to his return and his capture, when von Hutten and a handful of survivors staggered toward Coro in late 1544, they found a city that no longer recognized them. In their absence, the Spanish authorities, tired of Welser absenteeism, had named a new governor, Juan de Carvajal, appointed by the Audiencia of Santo Domingo. He had no interest in Welser contracts. Von Hutten protested. He claimed his title. He demanded recognition. Carvajal refused. At first, the standoff appeared bureaucratic. Letters, appeals, gestures, but tensions rose. In one exchange, Bartholomeus Welser the Younger, von Hutten's companion and heir to the banking house, wounded Carvajal with a sword. Carvajal backed off, then offered terms, safe passage, and an escort to the coast. Von Hutten accepted, and it was a mistake. On the road out of Coro, Carvajal's men ambushed the Germans. They were captured, chained, and returned to the city. There was no trial. As Pedro de Aguado later wrote, there was no sentence, only a sword, a plaza, and silence. Philip von Hutten and Bartholomeus Welser were beheaded in April of 1546. Their heads were displayed publicly, not as a warning to rebels, but as a punctuation of a failed financial fantasy. 8 years later, in 1556, the Welser concession was revoked. The books were closed, the Germans were gone, and Klein-Venedig was over. But the relationship between Germans and Venezuela would not end there. In the centuries that followed, others would come, not as conquerors but as chroniclers, scientists, and settlers. In 1800, Alexander von Humboldt would step into the same interior the Welsers once tried to own, not to plunder it, but to understand it. He would leave not alien forts and blood, but pages of scientific wonder and discovery. Not prisons, but the freedom offered by the scientific pursuit. And in 1843, high in the fog of the Cordillera, Colonia Tovar would be born, an unlikely Bavarian transplant with its steins, red roofs, and soft dialects, perched on Venezuelan soil like a memory that had taken root. Worlds coming together in episodes of another kind, where foreigners did not come barging in, but welcomed in the pursuit of human collaboration. Today, these stories, all of it, both the horrific and the beautiful, live somewhere inside the impossible knot of Venezuelan identity.